We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Tes Amid Beis in Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 19b. On the previous Amid, the Gemara said that if tzroros happens in Rosh Hashanah, then the person is patur. Not only that, let's say the animal kicks up the pebbles in Rosh Hashanah and it damages in Rosh Hashanah, that's patur also, since the beginning of that damage started in Rosh Hashanah. But the Gemara said, is that really true? V'amar Rav Yochanan, but Rav Yochanan said, this is later on in this parak, ein chatzi nezek cholok, that when it comes to chatzi nezek, we don't make distinctions. Lo Rosh Hashanah v'lo Rosh Hashanah, we don't make distinctions within Rosh Hashanah. We don't make distinctions within Rosh Hashanah, meaning chatzi nezek is something you always pay, even in Rosh Hashanah. That would imply that chatzi nezek tzroros as well is paid in Rosh Hashanah, against what we said on the previous Amud. My lav, is he not saying he tiza b'Rosh Hashanah v'hizika b'Rosh Hashanah, that even if you have a situation where the pebbles are kicked up in Rosh Hashanah and they damage in Rosh Hashanah, you don't make a distinction, and the chatzi nezek tzroros you pay even in Rosh Hashanah. And the Gemara says along the same lines as the previous Amud, lo no, he tiza b'Rosh Hashanah v'hizika b'Rosh Hashanah. Maybe all he means is that if it gets kicked up in Rosh Hashanah but damages in Rosh Hashanah, so then you're going to be, in that situation, you're going to be chayiv. But the Gemara says that's still not good. But we said again on the previous Amud, akira ein kan hanacha yesh kan, that if there's no akira, is there really a hanacha over here? Meaning to say, we said everything, if even part of it rather happens in Rosh Hashanah, we said pater. And Rabbi Yochanan seems to be saying in Rosh Hashanah there can be a chiyuv of chatzi nezek. Amar lei said to him, hadri bi, he said again, I retract that statement. Really what we are saying again is that if the damage happens in Rosh Hashanah, meaning the pebbles get kicked up in Rosh Hashanah, but the damage happens in Rosh Hashanah, so then we're going to say chayiv, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan means as well. Ein chatzi nezek cholok lo Rosh Hashanah v'lo Rosh Hashanah means chatzi nezek is paid in Rosh Hashanah, but the ultimate damage in that case did happen in Rosh Hashanah. And the Gemara continues by saying, if you want, we could say ki amar Rabbi Yochanan akeren. That Rabbi Yochanan wasn't talking about tzroros at all. You can't ask any questions from Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was talking about chatzi nezek by keren, that there's no distinction between Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Hashanah. And the Gemara continues, Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Nasi of Rabbi Oshia, Akila de Rabbi Yehuda, Nasi and Rabbi Oshia were sitting on the porch of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Nafak milsami beinayu, and they had the following question that came up. Kishkishab is a nava mahu. What if an animal, it's walking in the Rosh Hashanah and it's waving its tail back and forth? What's the halacha? Amar le'idach, so the other one said, V'chiyoch zenab is nava v'yelech. That's a normal thing to do. You have to walk around when you're walking with your animal in Rosh Hashanah. Does he have to hold on to the tail while he's walking? Of course not. Meaning to say, it's like a normal situation in Rosh Hashanah, you should be patur. But the Gemara says, Yihachi, if so, Karen Nami Nema. Why don't we make the same argument by Karen in Rosh Hashanah? Does a person have to go, when he has his animal in Rosh Hashanah, he has to go hold on to the horns of the animal? The Gemara says you can't compare the two. Hachi Ashta, what kind of comparison is that? Karen Lav Orche. When it comes to Karen, that's something that's not a normal thing to do. Ha Orche, but over here, this is totally normal. An animal is allowed to act in a normal fashion in Rosh Hashanah. And the Gemara says, well, if it's a normal thing to do, what was even the question? Of course we know that Shein and Regel are patur in Rosh Hashanah, and the Gemara says to that, Kitchkush Yiseirim Yiboile. The question is, what if it's waving around its tail in a way that's more than usual? So that was really the question. That already might be considered unusual behavior, and that's why that question came up. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Boy, Ravena asks the following question: Kishkasha ba'amasa mahu. What if it's swinging around? The animal is swinging around its male organ. Mi'amrinon midi to have Karen. Do we say that's really the same thing as Karen? Karen lav yitzra takifle. When an animal gores, isn't that the animal's yetzer hara that's overcoming it? Hachanami loshna. So here also it should be the same thing. It should be identical, treated the same as an animal goring. Odilmor, maybe Karen kavanaso lahazik. Karen is different because the animal's intention is to do damage. Ha'ain kavanaso lahazik. But in this case, there's no intention to do damage, and the Gemara says take, with the Gemara leaves that as a question. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Tarnagolin muadin lahalach kedarkon l'shabra v'chulu." Tarnagolin, chickens, are considered muad when they're walking in the normal manner and they break things. And then the Mishnah had a case where something was tied to the foot of the chicken and caused damage, and the Gemara wants to clarify exactly what happened. The Mishnah said that the payment is chatzi nezek, and the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna says, Lo shanu ela shenikshar me'elav. When our Mishnah says that the payment for the object that's tied to the foot of the chicken when it causes damage, when we say it's chatzi nezek, that's if it gets tied on its own. Aval kashro adam, but if a person ties it to the chicken, so then he's going to be chayiv to pay the full amount. And Rashi says, Lo shanu de chatzi nezek v'sulo. We only say it's chatzi nezek and only chatzi nezek. Ela shenikshar me'elav hadalil b'regel tarnagol, when it gets tied onto the foot of the chicken on its own. Aval kosher adam chayev hakosher nezek shalim. But if a person ties it onto the chicken, so then the person who tied it is actually chayev nezek shalim. To have a boar, the Gemara now is assuming that's already a boar. V'im niskal bo adam chayev b'niskal. Let's say a person trips over it, so then he's chayev to pay the full amount. So that's what the Gemara, Rav Huna, is making this distinction and saying nikshar me'elav is chatzi nezek and kosher adam, that's considered bor, and is chayiv to pay the full amount. And so the Gemara says nikshar me'elav, but if we're talking about in our Mishnah, we're talking about where apparently it's tied on its own, that's why we're saying it's chatzi nezek, but man chayiv, but who is the one that's actually chayiv? Ilema bal hadalil, if you're going to say it's the owner of the, whatever this object was that was tied to the chicken, if it's the owner of the dalil that's chayiv, so hechidami, well, what exactly is the case? Ida atzne, if the person put it in a proper place, he hid it away, so anasu, he's considered an onus, he's not going to be chayiv anything, he's not going to pay half. V'ilo atzne, and if, let's say, he didn't put it in the right place, so posheyahu, he's negligent, it's identical to him tying it onto the leg of the chicken, it should be considered his boar, and he should pay full. You don't have any reason why in these situations of boar, you should make a distinction between nikshar me'elav and kosher adam, that by nikshar me'elav it's half, and kosher adam it's going to be full. You're either going to pay full because you're responsible, it's your boar, or you're going to pay nothing. So elachai balatarnagol. So then rather you're going to argue that the owner of the chicken should be chayiv when it gets tied on its own. Maybe the owner of the chicken is chayiv half, but that also doesn't make sense. Ma'ishna kule nezek delo. What's the difference that you're not paying the full damage? Dechsiv ki yiftach ish bor v'lo shor bor. It says that by bor the person has to open up the pit, and an animal can't create the bor. So you'll say here by nikshar me'elav the chicken is creating the bor, so you're not going to pay the entire nezek. But chatzi nezek nami, then you shouldn't pay half either. Ish bor v'lo shor bor, because it says ish bor, and again the animal, the shor, the ox or the chicken in this case, can't create the bor. Otherwise there's going to be a patur over here. So again, that doesn't really make sense. What Rav Huna is saying to say chatzi nezek by nikshar me'elav does not make sense. And the Gemara says you're right. Ella rather masnisin b'da'adye aduye. Our Mishnah is not talking at all about bor at all. It's talking about tzroros. We mentioned this when we did the Mishnah. The animal is somehow kicking the item. It's kicking around the item that's attached to its leg, and it's essentially throwing that item, and that item is causing the damage, and that's why you're paying chatzi nezek. And Rav Huna, when he talked about nikshar me'elav and kosher adam and bor, he was not referring to our Mishnah at all. When Rav Huna made that statement, he was talking in general. He was saying as follows: Dalil hefker. Let's say you have this item that's tied to the chicken. It's ownerless. Nobody owns the item. Amar Rav Huna says nikshar me'elav, if it gets tied onto the chicken on its own, so patur, then you're patur in that case. But kosher adam, but if a person ties it on, so chayiv, then already the person who tied it on is chayiv because he's created a bor. And the Gemara says, Mishum mai chayiv, why is he chayiv? Amar Rav Huna bar Manoach says, Mishum boro hamisgalgel b'raglei adam of raglei behema. That's a case of a boar that gets rolled around by the feet of people and the feet of the animal, but the person who creates the boar is going to be chayiv. And Rashi says, Ela masnisin lo misuk ma'ela ba'adya aduye. Our Mishnah has to be talking about where shezora katarnagol hadalil, that the chicken essentially threw the item that was tied to its foot, v'shiber bizrikaso kalim, and when he kicked that item, when he threw it, it broke kalim to have its tzroros. It's a regular case of tzroros, chatzi nezek. Ve'afilu kasho adam nami lo mashalim and chatzi nezek balatarnagol. Even if a person tied the item onto the chicken, still the owner of the chicken is going to pay chatzi nezek. Ve'akosher pater, and the person who tied it is pater. Shalom niskal adam boro. He created a boar, but nobody tripped over his boar. What happened was a different kind of nezek. It was a nezek of tzroros, and the owner of the chicken will be chayiv. With Rav Huna lo mesukma masnisin ela bi'alma itmar. What Rav Huna said wasn't even going on our Mishnah. It's just a general rule. V'achi itmar dalil hefker v'chulu. If you have a situation of a dalil that is ownerless, nikshar me'elav, so if it gets tied onto the chicken, b'tarnagol on its own, v'niskal bo adam pater, and then someone trips over it, is pater. Dema'an l'chayiv. Who should be chayiv in that case? Dalil lesle bailam. The dalil has no owner. Baal hatarnagol nami. When it comes to the owner of the chicken also, ish bor amar achman v'lo shor bor, as we said, a person has to create the bor, not when an animal creates the bor, so pater. But kasho adam chayiv, but if a person ties it, so then chayiv, hakosha, the person who tied it on, is chayiv, the kanya b'hagba, because he's acquired this dalil by lifting it up. V'yesh lo lahai dalil bailam, and now there's an owner of this dalil, and it becomes like his bor. Misham mai mechayiv. The Gemara said, well, why are you chayiv? The halav bor ma'alihu. That's not a classic bor. Sharei lo hizik b'makom shekashu sham, because it didn't cause the damage in the place where it was tied. Shatarnagol goru l'makom acher. The tarnagol has moved on to a different location. And to that the Gemara said, boro hamiskalgel. Again, that's a bor hamiskalgel. The Ma'asinu Bava Kamma Ba'atzad hashav. We learn out a concept of a bor hamiskalgel in the first parak using a tzad hashav. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah. Mishnah, Ketzad Hashein Muedes, how is a shein considered a muad? Lechol es haroila. That's talking about in situations where it eats whatever is normal for it to eat. HaBehema Muedes lechol peiros v'yirakos. A behema is considered a muad when it comes to eating fruits and vegetables. Achlak sus okelim, if it eats a garment or vessels, Mishalim Chatzi Nezek, then the payment is only going to be Chatzi Nezek, because it's Meshuna, again, it's a strange kind of damage. B'amed Devar Mamurim, when is all of this true? B'Rishus HaNizik, it's true in the B'Rishus, in the Rishus, in the property of the Nizik. Aval B'Rishus HaRavim Potter, but in Rishus HaRavim, it's going to be Potter. V'yim Nanis, but the Mishnah says, let's say the animal got some kind of benefit out of what happened, even in a situation, let's say, where it should have been Potter on damages, but Mishalemes Mashenenis, you do have to pay the benefit that you derived. Ketzad Mishalemes Mashenenis. Now, how do you find cases where you have to pay that which was the benefit that was derived? Achla mitocher achava. Let's say it eats things right in the middle of the street. Mishalemes Mashenenis. You have to pay that which the animal benefited. Mitzidei harachava. But if it's at the side of the street, Mishalemes Mashehizika, then you pay the full damages. Mi Pesach hachanos. If it's at the opening, the doorway of a store, Mishalemes Mashenenis. It just pays the amount of benefit that it derived. Mitoch hachanos. But if it eats from within the store, Mishalemes Mashehizika. Then you have to pay the full damage. Rashi explains, Ketzad Hashein Muedus Umashani Lechol Esaroila. It's a question, how is the Shein Muad? And the answer is when it eats things that are normal, Mishalem is Chatzi Nezek, and again it's Chatzi Nezek if it eats something that's not normal, to Meshunahi, because that's not normal. Aval B'Rishus HaRavim Potter. Then the Mishnah said, presumably saying that Shein in Rishus HaRavim is Potter, Tiva'inanu Bir B'Stei Acher, because it needs to be Bir B'Stei Acher. But Rashi points out, V'achsus V'Kelim Nami Potter. Actually, the Mishnah means Potter even if it eats the garments or the kalim in Rishus HaRabim. The Gemara Mefarish line. The Gemara will explain what that means exactly. Mashenenis, and then the Mishnah said, but if there's a benefit that the animal derives from eating, so you have to at least pay that benefit. Lav tashlumin ma'alyaninu. That's not really full payment of damages. That's a lesser payment in terms of the benefit that the animal got. Kedim Mefarish B'Gemara, as the Gemara will explain. Mitzidei harachov. Now, if it's from the side of the street, Mishalemis Mashizika, then you pay according to whatever the damage was. Rashi says to that, Kedin Keren Tam. It actually follows the rule of Keren. A Tam Chatzi Nezek, Umuad Nezek Shalim. Tam is going to pay half, a Muad will pay full. And again, Rashi says, the Gemara will explain exactly what we are saying here in the Mishnah. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hashein Muedes Lechol Esaroila. By shein, the animal is considered a muad to eat things that are normal for it to eat. Ketzad how so? Behema shenichnas al chatzar hanizik. Let's say an animal enters into the courtyard of the nizik. V'achla ochlin haruyin law, eats things that are normal for it to eat. V'shasa mashkin haruyin law, and drinks things that are normal for it to drink. Meshalim nezik shalim. The payment's going to be a full payment. That's the halach of shein. V'chein chaya shenichnas al chatzar hanizik. Similarly, let's say a wild animal enters into the chatzar of the nizik. V'tarfa behema, and tears up a behema v'achla basar, and eats the meat. Meshalim nezik shalim is going to pay nezik shalim. And the Brisa continues, Uparasha achla sa'orin. Let's say you have a cow that eats barley that's not actually the normal food for a cow. V'chamor shachal karshinan, or let's say you have a donkey that eats vetches, that's a kind of legumes that's not usually eaten by a donkey. V'kelev shalikek es hashaman, or let's say a dog eats, it licks up the oil. V'chazir shachal chaticha shel basar, or a pig eats a cut of meat. In all of these cases, even though it's not exactly the normal food that they eat, Mishalman nezek shalim, nevertheless, in all of these cases, the payment is the full payment of damages. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rapapa says, Hashta da amrit kol midi delav urche v'ochle le al yedei adachak. Now that you're saying even things which is not really normal for the animal to eat, but it would eat it if it's in a pressure situation, in a forced situation, shmei achili, you're calling that regular normal eating. So once we're saying that halacha, haishunra da'achal tamri, let's say you have a cat that eats dates, v'chamra da'achal benisur, let's say you have a donkey that eats fish, mishalim nezek shalim. So in all these cases, you're going to pay nezek shalim, the full damages. And Rashi explains, Shunra da'achal tamri, if a cat eats dates, it's normal to eat it again if the animal is very hungry. Aval ksus v'kelim, but let's say the shunra would eat garments or vessels, then afilu al yedei adachak, even if it's a situation of dachak, even if it's a situation where the animal is very hungry, lav orche lemechlin, it's not normal to eat those items, ela miskavin lahazik. That's already called a situation where the animal is having intention to do damage. And the Gemara continues, there was a donkey that ate bread, and then when it was eating the bread out of the basket, it broke the basket. So Rav Yehuda said the owner has to pay the full amount in terms of the bread. And in terms of the basket, you only pay chatzi nezek. That's considered to be meshuna. That's considered to be a strange kind of damage. Rashi says, upalse lo asu. It could mean it chewed up the basket. Lishna achrina palse sidko v'lo shamati. It could mean that palse means it broke the basket. basket. Rashi says he didn't hear that. Asala chatzi nezek, so you're going to pay, in any case, you're going to pay chatzi nezek on the basket to mishunahu, because that's considered something that's a shinoi, it's strange. Uchagon the tafas nizek. Now the case over here has to be where the nizek actually took his money, he took the chatzi nezek, the ein don in dine knossos bebavel, because you usually don't judge laws involving fines in Bavel. This was something that Rav Yehuda did in Bavel, upalga nizka knasa, and again we said earlier that chatzi nezek is considered a knas. In any case, what he paskined was that when it comes to the basket, it's considered to be a shinoi, and therefore it's chatzi nezek. But the Gemara asks, V'amai, but why is this true? If it's already normal to eat the bread, isn't it also normal that when it's eating the bread, so it's going to chew the basket or it's going to damage the basket as well? And the Gemara says not necessarily because the case could be where it ate the bread first and then only later it went ahead and damaged the basket, so that's already a shinoi, and again you're going to pay chatzi nezek. But the Gemara continues, upas orchehu, but is it really normal for the chamor, for the donkey, to eat the bread? You're saying you have to pay nezek shalem, or a minute, but we have the following contradiction. Achla pasu vasar v'tavshil mashalim chatzi nezek. It says that if the animal eats bread or meat or a cooked item, you only pay chatzi nezek. Apparently it's not normal. And my lav is it not? Behema, we're talking about a behema. We're talking about a domesticated animal, just like the case that Rav Yehuda had with the donkey. And here you see chatzi nezek. Rav Yehuda said nezek shalem. The Gemara says lo no bechaya. It could be that this brisa that we just quoted is not talking about a behema. It's actually talking about a wild animal, a chaya. Chaya, it's not normal for a chaya to have bread. But the Gemara says chaya basar or chehu. But when it comes to a wild animal, meat actually is normal, and meat also is chatzi nezek in this brisa. And the Gemara says to that, the matvi, we're talking about roasted meat. It's not normal for a chaya to eat roasted meat. If you want, we could say that the animal that we're talking about in this brisa is actually a deer. A deer does not eat bread, and it does not normally eat meat as well. And if you want, we could say, really, this brisa is talking about a behema, and so why is it all not normal? Again, we said a behema eats bread. We're talking about where it's actually eating from what's on the table. That's not a normal way for the behema to eat, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph.